It was summer somewhere in the middle of the White Mountains. I had been hiking for hours alone, deep into the woods. The morning mist had mostly burned off by now, leaving a cool, dry air that made each breath feel crisp. The trail was getting harder to navigate, and the trees seemed to close in around me more tightly as I moved forward. But I was used to this. I'd spent years hiking, camping, and exploring the woods, so this wasn't my first solo trip. I had planned for a short hike that day, just a few miles out and back, but I had strayed from the beaten path a bit. The sense of isolation was strange, but in a way I relished it. The quiet was different from the city noise I left behind. But this was different. It was around 7 a.m. when I noticed something off. The usual sounds of birds, insects, and the rustle of leaves had disappeared. The forest felt oddly silent. That silence, like the calm before a storm, set off a wave of unease that spread through me. My senses sharpened as I looked around, trying to understand what was wrong. I adjusted the straps of my backpack and kept walking, the air growing heavier. The deeper I went, the more I felt like I was being drawn into something. It wasn't until I stumbled upon the campsite that I realized something was very wrong. I almost didn't see it at first. The edges of the campsite were hidden by overgrown brush, and the tent was barely noticeable through the trees. It wasn't the usual neatness of a well-set-up camp. The first thing that hit me was the scent. Something metallic, almost like rust, mingled with the sharp tang of something wrong. I stopped, frozen. I was always cautious, but now I was starting to feel a real prickle of dread crawl up my spine. I stepped closer, trying not to make noise. The shredded tent under the tree caught my attention first. It was torn apart as if something had viciously attacked it. The fabric was barely hanging on, with deep rips running through it, and it was covered in dark, streaky stains. But what really made my stomach drop was the human figure slumped near the tree. A man, barely conscious, covered in blood. He was sitting upright, his back against the tree, his eyes barely open, blinking in slow motion as if trying to process reality. His clothes were torn, and his hands were shaking. His body was covered in deep slashes, gashes so wide that I could see the tissue underneath. He was covered in so much blood that at first, I couldn't even tell where the cuts began and where they ended. I froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. Something wasn't adding up. His wounds were too clean, too precise. These weren't the marks you'd get from a wild animal. They were too structured, too deliberate. The man looked like he had gone through a battle, but with no clear enemy in sight. His breaths were shallow and labored, and he let out small, whimpering noises, the kind you don't expect to hear from a grown man. It was like a wounded animal's cry, soft but desperate. I put my bag down quietly and grabbed my first aid kit. I had no idea what had happened here, but I knew this person needed help, and fast. I didn't even look for any signs of what might have caused this. My focus was on the man. As I moved closer, I could see more details. The slashes across his chest were deep enough to expose the muscle underneath. His face was pale, the kind of pale you get when blood loss starts to take its toll. The worst part, though, was the back of his neck and shoulders. Puncture marks, one after another, going down his spine. There were defensive cuts all over his hands, his forearms, like he'd been fighting something off. The sight of it made my gut twist. I thought about getting him out of here right away, but his condition was too bad for me to carry him. I quickly set to work, cleaning his wounds as best as I could, bandaging him up, and giving him some water from my bottle. I didn't have much in the way of medical supplies, but I did what I could. I didn't speak to him. He wasn't in any state to respond, and I didn't want to make him worse. I took a quick look at my map, checked the compass, and figured the nearest road was less than 2 miles away. It wasn't far, but with his condition, I wasn't sure if he'd make it. After giving him another drink of water and securing my gear, I lifted him into a sitting position, propping him up as best I could. I knew I had to move fast. The adrenaline was kicking in, and though I was trying to remain calm, there was a knot of fear in the pit of my stomach. I kept telling myself that I could get him to safety, just get to the road. The walk to the road was tense. With every step, I kept glancing over at him, trying to gauge whether he was still breathing, if he was still alive. His breathing was shallow, but steady, which was a small comfort. The pain he must have been in, though, was unimaginable. I could only guess at how much of a struggle it had been for him. The blood had congealed in patches around the cuts on his body, and I could see that he was growing weaker with every passing minute. When I reached the road, I barely had time to catch my breath before a car came into view. I flagged it down, and thankfully the driver stopped. They weren't the most talkative person, but that didn't matter. They helped me load the man into the back seat and drove to the nearest station. I didn't say much during the ride. There was nothing to say. I was too focused on keeping him alive. When we reached the station, I helped unload him, and the medical staff took over immediately. They were quick to assess him, and by some miracle, he was still breathing. They offered to clean up and take care of me too, and I agreed, needing a break after the chaos of the past few hours. I was sore, exhausted, and covered in grime by the time I finished getting cleaned up. The staff offered me some food and coffee, and I sat there, trying to collect my thoughts. It was surreal. I had just found a person barely alive in the middle of nowhere, and now I was sitting in a station like it was just another day. It didn't feel real. The whole thing felt like a nightmare I hadn't fully woken up from. Before I left my number with them, asking to be updated on the man's condition. It took me 3 days to get back home, and by the time I did, I had nearly forgotten about it. That was when the phone call came. I was standing in my kitchen, unpacking from the trip when the message on my machine played. The story that came through was almost as strange as the scene I had found. The man I helped, they said, had decided to try his hand at camping. But he didn't know the first thing about the woods. He'd heard the advice to hang food from a tree to keep bears away, but he'd done it all wrong. Instead of hanging the food high, he'd placed it just above the tent. And not only that, but he didn't even hang it properly. The night before I found him, a bear had tried to get the food. It wasn't uncommon for bears to forage, but this one must have been desperate. It clawed its way up the tree, and when it couldn't reach the food, it used the tent and its occupant to try and get there. The man had woken up to find himself underneath 4 massive bear paws, feeling claws dig into his chest and stomach, all while the bear tried to reach the food above. He fought back with everything he had, trying to protect himself, but the bear wasn't interested in him as a meal. It just wanted the food. The man had somehow survived the ordeal, but just barely. The hospital staff said he was a mess, physically and emotionally. He swore to them that he was done with the wilderness forever. He was moving to the city, and he'd never step foot in the woods again. Couldn't blame him. What he'd gone through was unimaginable. As for me, I've been in the woods a lot since then, but something about that day still haunts me. The quiet, the stillness, the look in that man's eyes when I found him. Some things are just too much to understand, but in the end, the woods, no matter how beautiful, can be unforgiving. Of the countless hours I've spent in the woods, it's the one time, the only few seconds that I can't explain. The one moment that keeps haunting my thoughts, even now. I've hiked in the woods in all kinds of conditions, from the clearest mornings to the heaviest downpours, but this experience, this one single instance, felt like something primal, something that, no matter how much I try, I can't make sense of. I distance hike whenever I can. I've grown accustomed to the routine, the quiet rhythm of my boots on the trail, the steady burn of my muscles as I push for another few miles. Sometimes this means getting up at the crack of dawn, Other times it means staying out well into the night to get as many miles in as possible. It's in these late night hours, when the forest falls into the deepest stillness, that things get a little spooky. I've done it enough times to know what to expect, but there's always that feeling, the feeling that you're not quite alone, that maybe, just maybe, something's watching. I grew up in these woods, on the edge of them, actually, where the trees meet the field, and the sounds of the outside world feel like they fade into nothing. I've slept under our canopy of stars more nights than I can count, woke to the soft rustling of deer grazing close by, or the distant hoot of an owl keeping watch over its territory. I've hiked, camped, hunted, and even gotten lost more times than I can remember. I know this land as well as I know my own skin. Every trail, every bend, every rock, and every tree has its place in my memory. But this particular morning, this was different. It was late spring. The air had a chill to it that you don't expect in warmer months, the kind that brushes against your skin and makes you shiver, but only slightly. The first light wouldn't be visible in the treetops for another 30 to 45 minutes, and there was still an hour or so until full sunrise. At 0430 it was dark, and the night was still holding tight. The only thing breaking the silence was the soft pad of my boots on the mud-caked trail as I pushed forward. I was on mile 5, deep into the bottom of a valley that was wedged between two steep ridges. The trail was narrow, the air thick with moisture, and the only sound was my breathing. The underbrush was dense here, young maple saplings and twisted oak trees creating an almost impenetrable wall around me. The trail had been muddy, the kind of thick, sticky mud that clings to your boots, but it was manageable. My headlamp, the only source of light, cast a weak, dull glow ahead of me, just enough to keep my path visible. My thoughts were drifting, lost in the rhythm of each step. The forest felt like it was holding its breath, and I was barely aware of the stillness around me until it happened. Crack. The sound split through the silence like a gunshot, and I froze, my heart leaping in my chest. My head snapped up, and for a split second, I thought I had misheard it. The sound had been loud, too loud, and the timing of it made my stomach twist. It wasn't the usual noise of wind shifting through the trees or the snap of a branch falling to the ground. No, this had been something deliberate. For a moment, everything went still again. Not a single rustle in the leaves, not a single breath of wind. Felt like the entire forest had gone into hiding. In those first few seconds, everything in me screamed to turn around. My body was screaming for me to run, but I stayed rooted to the spot, my boots stuck in the mud, my mind racing. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew what I had just heard. It wasn't some random noise. This wasn't a branch breaking or the sound of deadfall hitting the ground. This was something deliberate, and that realization froze me in place. The fear came in waves, each one rolling through me with more intensity. Fight or flight. I knew the drill, but here, in this thick forest, at 0430 in the morning with the lights still far off, I wasn't sure which direction I should run. I thought about the sound. It was so clear, so specific. It had been loud, like a stick or a heavy branch being violently slammed against a small tree. The noise had been sharp, a crack more than a thud. Not a soft breaking of wood, but a powerful strike. Something like a fungo bat swinging against the trunk of a young tree. And it wasn't far away, maybe 50 yards at the most. I didn't dare move. I stood there, listening, waiting for something to happen. The woods, which had been so full of life only moments before, felt empty now. The kind of emptiness that feels unnatural, like it's been sucked out of the air. My breath fogged up my glasses, and I wiped them absent-mindedly as I scanned the darkness ahead. My mind spun between possibilities, none of them reassuring. Maybe it was a person, someone else out here in the woods, or maybe it was something else, something far worse. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The only thing I could hear was the pounding of my own heart in my ears. I considered turning around and heading back, but the thought of retreating made me sick to my stomach. I had no idea what that noise had been, but I was certain it wasn't something I wanted to confront head-on. The trail ahead of me curved sharply in about 30 yards, leading up the ridge away from the creek. This meant that when I did move, I would have to turn my back to whatever it was, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting, watching. I waited. It was dead quiet. There was no more noise. I wanted to believe it was nothing, just the woods playing tricks on me. But in my gut, I knew. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and every instinct I had told me that this was no ordinary hike. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I gathered what little courage I had left and slowly started moving forward, one cautious step at a time. My headlamp flickered with each step, casting long, distorted shadows of the trees that loomed ahead. Every branch, every vine, seemed to move with the faintest breeze, but I knew better than to trust it. The trail was narrow, the underbrush thick, and my focus was entirely on the bend ahead. If I could just make it there, I told myself I would be out of the worst of it. As I neared the turn, the scent hit me, a stench so foul, so repulsive, that it nearly knocked the air out of my lungs. It was impossible to describe fully, but I'll try. It was like wet, rotting flesh, a smell of decay so deep it burned my nostrils. Something about it was wrong in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't just a dead animal smell, but something older, more sinister. It lingered in the air, thick and oppressive. I didn't stop. I pushed forward, my heart hammering in my chest. The ridge was close now, and I could see the faint outline of the trees ahead. The first light was just beginning to spill over the horizon, painting the world in soft shades of blue and gray. I didn't stop until I had climbed to the top of the ridge, my breathing heavy, my body slick with sweat despite the cold air. And still, I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just kept moving, faster now, my pace quickening as the daylight grew stronger. The birds hadn't started chirping yet, but the forest was no longer silent. I could hear the wind stirring in the treetops, the soft rustle of leaves, the creak of branches. The world felt normal again. I don't know what I heard that morning. I don't know what made that noise or why the air smelled like death. I've hiked these woods for years, and I've seen and heard just about everything the forest has to offer. But I've never encountered anything like that. It wasn't a bear or a deer or any kind of animal I recognize. It wasn't human either. There's no rational explanation for what happened, no clear answer. And the worst part still doesn't sit right with me. It's the one experience that doesn't have a neat explanation, and that's why it's stuck with me all this time. There are sounds in the woods that we can explain. Wind, animals, trees shifting in the breeze. But there are others, like this one, that just don't fit. And no matter how many times I try to rationalize it, I can't shake the feeling that something was out there that morning, something I'll never fully understand. So now, when I head out on a hike, when I walk those familiar trails, there's always a part of me that's listening for that crack again, waiting for the smell to hit the air. And even though I've been out there 100 times since, I can't forget that moment. The one moment that's still, after all these years, the one I can't explain. I've always been drawn to the outdoors. There's something about being in the wilderness, miles away from civilization, that both calms and excites me. It was a perfect weekend, with clear skies and just enough chill in the air to remind you that fall was closing in. My buddies and I had decided to tackle a section of the Appalachian Trail, a trip we'd been talking about for a while. The excitement of the hike, the promise of long days filled with nothing but miles of trail, towering trees, and quiet moments. It was exactly what we needed. We'd been on the trail for hours, the kind of hike where you lose track of time and don't care. the rhythm of your feet against the earth, the hum of the forest. It all blurs together. The only sounds were the occasional chirp of birds or the rustle of leaves as squirrels scurried about. Then we came across it. The trail had started to narrow, the trees leaning in closer, the air thickening with the smell of moss and wet bark. There was a slight bend ahead, and as we rounded it, we saw something that immediately caught our attention. A bundle of sticks. It was just off to the side of the path, but positioned carefully, leaning against a large rock as if someone had intentionally placed it there. At first, I thought it was just some random pile of branches, but the more I looked at it, the more I realized it wasn't just that. The sticks were arranged in a way that reminded me of something I'd seen before, those weird, unsettling figures from the Blair Witch Project. You know, the kind of thing that makes your skin crawl just by looking at it. I had a moment where I thought about the possibility of it being something, well, not human, but brushing that thought aside, I figured it was probably just another hiker messing around, or maybe someone out there just left it for fun. I picked it up, deciding it'd make for a cool souvenir, and tucked it into my backpack. We didn't say much about it after that. The hike was long, and we had to keep moving. We finally reached our camping spot by a small clearing, a perfect place to set up for the night. The sky had darkened by the time we were done cooking up some instant ramen and dehydrated meals. We were all tired, so after a quick conversation about how great the day had been, we each retreated to our tents to sleep. The night was peaceful, if not a little too quiet. I had a hard time falling asleep, the kind of feeling you get when the silence is almost too much to bear. I kept hearing things. A branch cracking here, the distant rustling of something in the underbrush there, but nothing too unusual, just the woods being woods. The next morning I woke up first. My eyes blinked open to the dim light of dawn filtering through the tent fabric. I could hear the others still snoring softly in their tents, so I decided to get the coffee going. The forest was still, the air cold and crisp, and I felt that familiar thrill of being alone out there. I stepped out of the tent, stretching my arms above my head, when my eyes landed on the campfire. It was just a pile of charred wood from last night's fire, but something caught my eye. Sitting right on top of the remains was the same bundle of sticks. It took me a second to process what I was seeing. I froze, staring at it. My mind raced, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. This couldn't be a coincidence. The exact same bundle we had found on the trail the day before, placed carefully on top of the ashes. But I knew for certain that none of us had put it there. My first thought was to check my backpack, just to make sure I wasn't imagining things. I unzipped it, pulled out the bundle I had picked up the day before, and stared at it. Same size, same shape. There was no doubt in my mind. The one on the fire had to be placed there by someone else. I called out to my buddies, who groggily shuffled out of their tents. I didn't mention the stick bundle at first, trying to remain calm, but I could see the confusion on their faces when they saw the pile. They swore they didn't put it there either. We all had the same thought. Someone else must have been around, someone else who was up and active while we were sleeping. But the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. It wasn't like we were on a popular trail. We were miles away from the nearest campsite, deep in the woods. Whoever had placed that bundle had to be either incredibly close, or it was some kind of bizarre coincidence. But the more I looked at the two bundles, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The bundles were nearly identical. In fact, they were almost too identical. It was hard to believe anyone could make such a close replica without seeing the original. We were far from the trail, and there was no way anyone could have snuck up on us, made the replica, and left it on top of the firewood without us noticing. As the morning wore on, I couldn't stop thinking about it. We packed up our campsite, trying to push the weirdness out of our heads. Maybe it was just a weird coincidence, a prank that one of us had played and forgot about. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We finished our hike and made our way back to the car, the usual chatter of the trail easing the tension, but I could tell everyone was just as uneasy as I was. We never spoke much about the bundles after that, not even as we left the woods. It felt like the kind of thing you didn't want to dwell on. But in the quiet of my own mind, I couldn't let it go. Here's the thing that messes with me, though: the bundle in my pack was still the one I had picked up from the trail. The one I found by the fire was not the same one. No matter how you looked at it, there was no reasonable explanation for how that stick bundle ended up there. The thing that truly unsettled me was the idea that someone had been close enough to our camp to leave it there without us knowing. That they might have been watching us. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe one of my buddies had played a joke on the other two. But honestly, I just can't wrap my head around the timing and precision of it all. No one ever came forward about it, and to this day, none of us can agree on what happened. I've thought about it more than I'd like to admit, and sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods again, I still wonder if someone, or something, was waiting just outside of our camp, quietly watching us while we slept. And if that wasn't creepy enough, I'll never forget that feeling, that nagging sense that something had been too close. Maybe we didn't see them, but they saw us. I don't know for sure, but I think I'd rather not. When I was in high school, we took a school trip to hike the Georgia section of the Appalachian Trail, and then we planned to head up into Tennessee. We had a small group, around 15 of us, plus 2 teachers. I think it was supposed to be a team-building thing, but honestly, it felt like just another trip to get us out of class. I'd never been on a trip like this before. Hiking, sleeping in shelters, relying on the group. It was all new, and I wasn't sure how it would go. The first day was pretty standard. Long stretches of quiet trails, the smell of pine trees, the occasional chirp of birds, the crunch of dirt and leaves underfoot. Everyone in our group was talking and laughing, mostly enjoying the outdoors, even if it was a little muddy and the air was damp. We took breaks every now and then, some of us more out of shape than others, but we kept moving. By evening, we'd arrived at the shelter where we were supposed to spend the night. It was one of those simple wooden structures built by the Park Service, with an open space where we could set our bags and sleep, and a roof overhead to shield us from the weather. The first thing that struck me about the shelter was the odd man who was already there when we arrived. He was sitting at the far end, facing the fire pit, in a faded green jacket and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face. He didn't look like he belonged there, not like the usual hikers. His clothes were worn and patched up in places, and he had the sort of scruffy beard you only see on people who spend most of their days in the woods, away from any razor or mirror. He barely acknowledged us when we walked in. We said our hellos, and the teachers made sure we set up our bags in an orderly fashion, but the guy didn't say much. His eyes followed us for a moment before he turned back to the fire, seemingly uninterested in whatever conversation was happening around him. We didn't think much of it. After all, we were out in the middle of nowhere, and the woods always bring all sorts of people. Some just prefer to keep to themselves. So we set about cooking our dinners, chatting amongst ourselves and trying to enjoy the night. It wasn't until much later that I noticed the strange things about him. As the evening wound down, some of us gathered around the fire to keep warm. The man, who I later learned was named Bill, didn't join us. He stayed off to the side, fiddling with something in his pack. His movements were slow, deliberate, like he was organizing his things with care, almost too much care. There was something unsettling about it, but at the time I didn't pay it much attention. A few of us were sitting around the fire when Bill suddenly got up and walked over to where we were. He didn't say anything, but one of the guys asked if he had a cigarette. Bill nodded, pulled out a battered pack of smokes from his coat pocket, and handed it over. The guy took one, and Bill rummaged through the pack for a few moments, muttering to himself as he pulled out another, and then a third. When he gave the last one to me, I noticed something strange. His pack didn't just contain cigarettes. As he opened it up to grab another, I saw the contents of his bag spilled out. There was a bottle of whiskey, 2 or 3 dozen small, folded mousetraps, several sealed pouches of tobacco, and, oddly enough, a single book. That was it. No food.
No snacks.
No sign of anything to eat at all. I stared at the mousetraps for a long time, feeling a chill run up my spine. Bill must have caught mice with them. The thought was so strange, so out of place in the middle of this beautiful forest. It didn't fully hit me until after he had already left. But then, the details started to bother me. Why didn't he have any food? Why only tobacco and whiskey? And the mousetraps? There was something almost methodical about how he had arranged them in his bag, like he had planned every move of his life in the woods. The conversation shifted back to the normal topics: sports, school, the usual teenage stuff, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about Bill. We stayed up for a while longer, laughing and talking by the fire, but I kept glancing over at him, still sitting in the same spot, barely moving. I had this nagging thought that he wasn't really here with us. He wasn't part of the group. He was just existing in the same space, living his own strange, isolated life. I couldn't stop looking at the mousetraps, and I couldn't stop imagining what he must have been doing in the dark woods, setting them up in the dead of night, listening for the snap of the traps and the faint rustle of mice trying to escape. Later, when it was time to sleep, I lay awake in my sleeping bag, the smell of the fire still thick in the air, the occasional hoot of an owl echoing in the distance. Every creak of the shelter made me jump, and I found myself straining to hear if anyone was moving outside in the night. I never heard anything from Bill, but I couldn't shake the thought that he might have been out there, working in the dark, catching whatever critters he could with those traps. The next morning, I woke up early to the sound of rustling. I rubbed my eyes and blinked into the half-light of dawn. Bill was already up, packing his things in his usual quiet manner. He had a strange smile on his face as he picked up his gear, a smile that seemed almost satisfied? Couldn't be sure. His eyes were narrow, his face hidden under his hat, but there was something about him that looked almost content in a way I couldn't place. We were all half awake, stumbling around to make breakfast, still groggy from a night of restless sleep. I saw Bill slip out quietly, without a word. The odd thing was, he didn't really seem to be in a hurry. It was like he was just drifting through, leaving us behind, slipping out of the shelter and back into the woods as easily as he'd come in. It wasn't until after he left that I realized something. There was no food in his bag. No snacks, no jerky, nothing that would suggest he'd been preparing for a long hike. Just tobacco, whiskey, and traps. I didn't realize it at the time, but I could have offered him something, a granola bar or a trail mix packet, but he didn't seem to need it. It was like he didn't care about food, as if he was living off something else. Something hidden in the woods beyond what we could see. As the group packed up to continue our hike, I found myself thinking more and more about Bill and his traps. There were no mice around the shelter when we left, but I had a feeling that Bill had caught more than enough the night before. He didn't need to talk to us. He didn't need to explain anything. He was fine on his own, doing his own thing in the deep woods, surviving in a way I couldn't understand. I still don't fully understand what drove him to live like that. Was he just some hermit out there for the peace and solitude? Or was there something darker behind those traps? Something that went beyond catching a few mice? I'll never know. Maybe that's part of the mystery of it all. But I can't help but wonder what happened to him after that night. I hope he's doing well, catching the mice he wants to catch, or whatever it is he's hunting in the woods. Some people just belong to the forest, and maybe Bill was one of them. There's something about the bush in Australia that gets into your bones. It's not the same as being in the city, surrounded by lights and noise. Out there, it's different. It's just you and the land with nothing else for miles around. The air is heavy. The trees seem to stretch on forever, and the silence can be so thick it feels like it's pressing down on you. When I was younger, my friends and I loved going out into the bush for a different kind of adventure. We weren't looking for hiking trails or scenic overlooks. No, we wanted something more, something that felt like it belonged to us. And there was a place, deep in the wilderness, about 4 kilometers from the nearest road, where we would go to drink and escape the rules. It was far enough that no one could bother us, and no one could hear us if things went wrong. That's where my friends went that night. They had done it before many times and knew the way well. They carried a case of beer and a bottle of spirits, like we always did, and set off into the woods as the sun dipped below the horizon. They would camp out, drink until they couldn't remember much, and then sleep under the stars, the soft hum of the bush surrounding them. They were too young to understand how dangerous it was, or how easily things could go wrong. I didn't go with them that night. For some reason, I stayed behind. Maybe it was the weather. Dark clouds had started to roll in as they packed up their stuff, but they didn't think much of it. I don't know why they didn't check the forecast. Maybe they didn't care. They were young, invincible, and the rain didn't seem like a problem. They always knew how to have a good time, no matter what. So they left, and I stayed behind. That night, the rain started heavy. I could hear it slapping against the roof of my house, growing louder as the hours passed. The kind of rain that comes down in sheets, thick and relentless. But I didn't think much of it. I didn't know what was happening out there, in the bush, where my friends were holed up, waiting for the storm to pass. By the time they decided to leave the campsite, the rain was too much to ignore. 5 of them, all drenched and shivering, had packed up what little they could carry and started heading toward a nearby set of caves. These caves weren't just any caves. They were high up, overlooking a large fork in the Hawkesbury River, a place where you could stand at the entrance and look out over the dark, twisting water far below. It was remote, quiet, and isolated, and to them it felt safe. Felt like it would be dry, but they were wrong. The rain had soaked through their clothes, and the air had grown cold. They were drunk, stumbling through the woods, laughing one moment and shivering the next. They were too young to realize how dangerous it was. They only thought about getting out of the rain. When they found the caves, they thought they had finally escaped the worst of it. The rock was cold and hard under their hands as they crawled inside, finding some shelter from the storm. But the caves were no refuge from the cold. It was just as damp inside as it was outside, and the wind seemed to howl through the cracks in the stone. So, being drunk and bored, they decided to make a fire. They figured it would help warm them up. They didn't think much about it, didn't even stop to consider if it was safe to start a fire in a place like that. They just started digging. One of them, his name was Mike, was the first to get his hands into the dirt. He scraped away at the earth, trying to find a flat spot to build the fire. It wasn't long before his fingers brushed against something that wasn't dirt, something solid and hard. At first, he didn't know what it was. He thought it was just a rock, but then he noticed the shape. It was wrong. It wasn't smooth like a rock. It was jagged, uneven, and strange. Mike dug a little deeper, and that's when the others saw it too. There, buried just under the surface, were bones. Pieces of bone, scattered and half-crushed, all tangled up in the dirt. They didn't know what to think. The alcohol was still clouding their judgment. They dug a little more, and the bones came loose. The shape became clearer. It was a human skeleton, or at least part of one. There was no mistaking it. The bones were old, too old to be from anyone they knew, but still it was unnerving. They had uncovered something buried deep in the earth, something that shouldn't have been disturbed. At that moment, everything changed. The fire didn't seem so important anymore. The alcohol lost its charm. The caves that had seemed like a safe refuge now felt ominous, like the earth itself was pushing back at them. The air grew heavier, and a chill crawled up their spines. They had made a terrible mistake. None of them said anything, but they all felt it, the weight of what they had uncovered. They didn't know if they should leave or stay, but none of them wanted to stay in that cave with the bones. They didn't know what to do. They were too scared to go back to the campsite, too scared to go anywhere. The rain outside had become a downpour, and the wind was howling through the trees. So they did what any scared group of teenagers would do. They stayed put, hoping the storm would pass. But the storm didn't pass. The night dragged on, the rain never stopping, and the caves felt colder and colder as the hours went by. It was an uncomfortable, miserable night. They huddled together for warmth, barely speaking, too scared to even move much. They could hear the howling wind outside, the rain pounding against the cave's entrance, but it was the silence inside that bothered them the most. The silence that seemed to stretch on forever, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves outside or the soft sound of someone shifting in the dark. Morning finally came, but it didn't bring relief. The rain was still falling, though not as heavily. The ground was muddy, and the air was thick with humidity. They left the caves not because they were ready, but because they had no other choice. The walk back to the campsite was slow, tense. They didn't talk much. They were too tired, too shaken up, too disturbed by what they had found. When they finally reached the site, they packed up and left without saying a word. They didn't even look back at the place where they had drunk, laughed, and gotten drunk so many times before. They just wanted to get out of the bush, away from the caves, and away from the bones they had uncovered. The police arrived the next day after a call from one of the parents. They had to investigate. The remains were examined, and the conclusion was something that none of my friends could have expected. Those bones didn't belong to a lost hiker or someone who had wandered into the bush long ago. They belonged to someone far older, someone who had lived there long before my friends had ever set foot in the bush. The remains were determined to be from an ancient Aboriginal burial site. The bones had been buried with respect, left undisturbed for generations, but now they had been unearthed by chance and carelessness by a group of teenagers seeking shelter. The police relocated the remains, ensuring they were treated with the respect they deserved. They warned everyone in the area to be careful, to never disturb the earth in places where history lies hidden. My friends never went back to that spot again. None of them ever spoke about it much after that night. They didn't need to. They knew what they had done, and they knew how lucky they were to have gotten away with it. But none of us could shake the feeling that we had disturbed something far bigger than ourselves, something that we could never fully understand. The bush was still there, as wild and untamed as ever, but it felt different now. It felt like something was watching, waiting, keeping an eye on us. And though I didn't go with them that night, I felt the weight of what they experienced. Something in the air, something in the land itself, seemed to whisper to me that the bush had always been there, long before any of us, and would be there long after we were gone. And that's the part that always stayed with me, that the land remembers, and sometimes when you disturb it, it remembers you too. When I think back on that Christmas, I always remember the feeling of the bush surrounding us. It was so thick and green, and the trees towered over our campsite like giants. I was only 5 at the time, but the memories are sharp, as if they were only yesterday. The air was fresh, and the world seemed quieter out there, cut off from everything else. My family, along with a few other families, used to go camping in that same spot every year. Christmas in the bush became a tradition, one that we all looked forward to. I wasn't the only kid there. There were 9 of us in total, all around my age, and we were allowed to wander through the bush while the parents prepared meals and sat around the fire. It was a pretty safe area, nothing too dangerous, and we had our walkie-talkies so the parents could keep track of us. None of us ever strayed too far from the campsite, but it was enough for us to feel independent. We'd chase each other through the underbrush, shout and laugh, and explore in groups. That day, I remember feeling particularly excited. It wasn't like any other day we'd spent out there. The morning was cool, with a crisp breeze rustling the leaves, and the smell of pine filled the air. It was Christmas Eve, and everyone was in high spirits, the excitement of Christmas still hanging in the air. The other kids and I were off exploring when something strange happened. It started as a quiet crackle from one of the walkie-talkies. I didn't think much of it at first, since that could happen sometimes. Static from the trees or interference from the signal. But then I heard it clearly. A man's voice, deep and smooth, cutting through the static. Ooh,
Ishuklat.
is this the group of kids camping out in the bush? I'm Santa, and I'm trying to find you to give you your presents. Are you out there? Can you hear me? I froze. The other kids looked at each other, wide-eyed. It was one of those moments where everything feels a little too real, a little too surreal to be true. But we were kids, and we didn't question it. We thought it was really Santa. Why wouldn't we? Our parents had always talked about how magical Christmas could be. And this was magic. We immediately started running back to camp. The others were just as excited as I was, and we rushed through the trees, calling out to each other, laughing as we imagined what Santa might look like if he found us out here in the middle of the bush. The walkie-talkie crackled again, and that deep voice came through. I'm getting closer now. Keep looking for me. We could feel the excitement building. The air seemed charged with it. As we got back to the campsite, we couldn't wait to tell the adults. Surely they'd be just as excited as we were that Santa was out there, trying to find us. But when we got back, the looks on the parents' faces were not what we expected. They were serious, even a little shaken. The walkie-talkie was taken from us immediately. My dad turned off the device and handed it back to one of the other parents, his face tense. "That's enough for today," he said, his voice calm but firm. The rest of the adults gathered together and started talking in low voices. We could hear bits and pieces of their conversation, and I remember one of the dads saying, "This isn't right. We don't know who's out there." Our excitement quickly turned to confusion. What was going on? Why were they so serious? It didn't make sense. We were all kids, and we didn't understand the gravity of the situation. We thought they were overreacting, that maybe it was just a prank, or that Santa was just playing along. But as the afternoon went on, the atmosphere in camp grew colder, more tense. No one was smiling anymore, not even the adults. We weren't allowed to leave the campsite after that. The parents gathered us all together and told us to stay close, not to wander off. Some of the older kids, who were usually allowed to go off exploring, sat in the circle with the rest of us, looking uncomfortable. The adults were too busy talking to each other to notice us anymore. Their voices, though quiet, carried over the campfire. They were talking about a man, someone who might have been trying to find us, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. I heard one of them say, "We should have told them to stay in the tents tonight." And then my dad, who never seemed to get upset about much, said, "We need to be careful." There was nothing else to do but sit there, the warm, crackling fire our only company. The sky darkened quickly, and the stars began to emerge, but the sense of unease didn't go away. We ate our dinner in silence, the mood heavy in a way I couldn't fully understand at the time. That night, we were told to go to bed early, which was unusual for a camping trip. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the ceiling of the tent, wondering why everything had changed so suddenly. I kept thinking about that voice on the walkie-talkie, Santa. It didn't feel real anymore, felt wrong. The next day, we packed up our things and left earlier than planned. Looking back on it now, I understand why the adults reacted the way they did. It wasn't just that they didn't want to spoil our Christmas excitement. They were scared. Scared of what might have happened if that voice had been something more than just a prank. There was a man out there, someone who had been watching us, using the walkie-talkie to get our attention. I don't think he had any bad intentions, but what if he had? What if he wasn't just trying to give us presents? The bush, the woods, it was no longer the magical place I thought it was. It was a place that hid secrets, that could swallow you up without a trace. And those walkie-talkies, something we had always used to feel connected, had been a tool for something else entirely. I'm glad nothing happened. I'm glad the worst that came out of it was the fear and confusion we felt that Christmas. But as an adult now, I look back on that moment and realize how serious it was. The voice on the walkie-talkie wasn't just an innocent mistake. It was someone, somewhere, using a tool that could have led to something far darker. We never went back to that campsite. Never again. And every time I hear a crackle on the radio, every time I see a walkie-talkie, I remember that voice. The voice that wasn't supposed to be there. The voice that changed everything. I had always been drawn to the idea of camping alone. There's something about being surrounded by nature, the quiet solitude, the sense of freedom. I'd done it before, several times in fact, but this trip was different. Maybe it was because I chose a more isolated spot, on the beach, far away from any trailhead or nearby campsite. Maybe it was the time of year, the dead of night when the world feels stiller, quieter. But for whatever reason, that night stuck with me. I'll never forget it. It was a few years ago, and I was camping by myself on this stretch of beach, miles away from the nearest town or even other campers. Just me, a tent, a small campfire, and the sound of the ocean. I had been walking along the beach earlier that evening, collecting driftwood, staring at the waves crashing against the shore, and just enjoying the peace. The sun had long gone down, and I'd set up my tent just a few feet from the high tide line. The stars were bright overhead, and the waves drowned out any noise from the outside world. By the time I crawled into my tent that night, I was already exhausted. The air was chilly, but I had a sleeping bag to keep warm, and the sound of the ocean was soothing enough to help me drift off. Everything felt normal, safe. I didn't know it then, but that night would turn my peaceful memories of camping into something darker. It was just after 3 in the morning when I woke up. Something wasn't right. At first, I thought it was the waves. Sometimes, when the tide came in, the sound would change, creating an eerie background hum. But this sound was different. It was soft, almost like something or someone was brushing up against the side of the tent. Not a harsh scraping, but a gentle pressing, like fingers lightly moving against the fabric. I lay still, listening, my heartbeat beginning to pick up. The waves were loud enough that I couldn't tell if it was something from outside or if my mind was just playing tricks on me. I tried to shake it off, closing my eyes, convincing myself it was nothing, just the ocean, maybe a gust of wind. But then it happened again. The sound like fingertips moving across the fabric of the tent. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't the wind, not by a long shot. Something was out there. I sat up, now fully awake. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what it could be. A raccoon? A wild animal? No, it wasn't right. There was no sound of scurrying or rustling, just that soft, deliberate brushing. I stayed as quiet as possible, straining to listen. My heart was thudding in my chest, and I could feel my body tensing up, ready to react. Then it happened again. This time, it wasn't just on one side of the tent. I felt the fabric shift, the pressure building on every side. It was as if someone was pushing in on the tent. The sides of the fabric bulged inwards, in strange, unsteady motions. It didn't make any sense. I wanted to scream, to call out, but I couldn't. My throat felt dry, my body frozen. Every instinct I had screamed to move, to escape, but my body wouldn't respond. I didn't even dare to breathe too loudly. I stayed as still as I could, feeling the outline of hands pushing in on every side of me. No sounds came from outside, other than the relentless roar of the ocean. Who was out there? What did they want? My mind raced in 1,000 directions. Were there more people? Was it some kind of prank? A bad joke someone was playing on me? But that didn't make sense either. This far out, who would be here at 3 a.m. just to mess with me? No one would. I stayed completely motionless, the pressure on the fabric now feeling like it was all around me. The tent was small, barely enough room for me to lie down comfortably, and now it felt like the walls were closing in. I could make out the shape of what seemed like hands on each side of the tent. My mind refused to fully accept what my eyes were seeing. This couldn't be real, could it? A few moments passed, though it felt like hours. Every second dragged on, thick and heavy, as the hands pressed in, almost gently, like they were testing the fabric, feeling for a way to get inside. There was no movement outside, no sound at all other than the waves. No footsteps, no breathing. Finally, the pressure stopped. It was sudden. One moment, the sides of the tent were pressing in, and the next, everything was still. I waited, unable to move, unable to do anything but listen to the pounding of my own heart. The stillness was deafening. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Could it have been a dream? A hallucination? But I knew it wasn't. I knew that what I had felt was real. It wasn't a trick of my mind. Something had been out there. The minutes dragged on, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the tent. I had to make sure it was safe, but I was too terrified to even unzip the door. What if they were still out there, waiting for me to come out? What if I was being watched? I stayed there in the darkness, my body trembling, too afraid to close my eyes. I could hear nothing but the ocean now, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore almost suffocating in its emptiness. Time seemed to stretch on forever. Then I couldn't take it any longer. I needed to know. Slowly, I reached for the zipper on the tent door, my hands shaking. I unzipped it as quietly as I could and pushed my head out into the night air. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. The sand outside was undisturbed, the beach empty. But as I moved the light around, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Footprints, shoe prints all around the tent. Dozens of them. Small, shallow impressions in the sand, scattered like someone had been pacing around my tent. They were everywhere, around the sides, the back, even near the entrance. Whoever it was had been walking around, staying just out of sight, waiting for me to make a move. I stepped out of the tent, my legs still weak. The air was cold against my skin, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I scanned the area, but the beach was deserted. There was no one in sight, no one hiding behind the rocks, no sign of movement, just the sound of the waves. Whoever had been out there had vanished, but the footprints were real. I stood there for a long time, staring at the prints, my flashlight flickering in the dim light. A chill ran through me as I realized how close I had come to something I couldn't explain. I didn't know if it had been a prank, a threat, or something else entirely. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I packed up as quickly as I could, shaking as I stuffed my gear back into my bag. The adrenaline kept me moving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still watching me, waiting for me to make my next move. My mind raced as I tried to rationalize what had happened. I had to believe it was just kids messing with me, just a group of pranksters, trying to scare someone alone on a deserted beach. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how creepy it all was. It wasn't just the footprints. It was the way they had moved around the tent, pressing in on all sides without making a sound. The way I hadn't heard a single footstep or breath, despite the fact that someone had been so close. The whole thing felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I hurried back to my car, almost stumbling as I made my way through the sand. The beach was quiet again, and the waves continued to crash against the shore, indifferent to the fear that had gripped me. I didn't look back as I drove away. I didn't want to know if someone was still following me. It's been years since that night, but I'll never forget it. Whenever I think about camping now, I remember the pressure on the sides of that tent, the feeling of something or someone pushing in, and the strange, eerie silence that followed. I still don't know who or what it was that night, but I've never camped alone on a beach again, and I never will. The sound of crashing trees woke me up, instantly ripping me from the deep sleep I had finally fallen into. My heart leaped, my mind scrambling to figure out what was happening. It sounded like a freight train coming through the woods, breaking branches with a force that seemed unnatural, shaking the ground beneath my tent. For a moment, all I could do was lie there, frozen in place, eyes wide open in the dark. My body was still groggy, but the adrenaline hit me like a jolt of lightning. I could hear the sounds of something massive moving, snapping trees as it got closer. The noise was deafening, branches cracking, leaves rustling violently. My breath hitched in my chest. What the hell was that? I didn't move, couldn't. Whatever it was too big to be anything I could handle. I was alone out here, deep in the woods, miles from any help. If it was an animal, it could easily crush me without a second thought. My mind raced, but I could barely process anything. I was gripping my sleeping bag so tightly, my knuckles turned white. The smell of the forest around me, the earth, the dampness in the air, all became sharper. The world felt still except for that terrifying noise. Suddenly, the sound came crashing even closer. It was so loud, so forceful, that I thought the ground might give way beneath me. The thud of something massive, something heavier than anything I had ever imagined, reverberated through the earth. I held my breath, not daring to make a sound, not even daring to move. The moose was right outside. I could hear its hooves scraping the ground, feel the vibrations as it moved with terrifying speed through the forest. The trees around me seemed to tremble in its wake. I heard it breathing heavily, a low, guttural sound like a train's engine straining under load. It was right there, so close I could hear it snorting, almost feel the heat of its body through the thin fabric of my tent. Time seemed to slow. I felt the air shift around me, the forest alive with this unknown threat. The smell of wet leaves, pine, and earth mixed with the sharp scent of fear that seemed to rise in my chest, suffocating me. My mind went into overdrive. How had it gotten so close without me hearing it approach? It wasn't a bear. The footsteps weren't that heavy. No, this was something else entirely. Something bigger. Something that could crush me without even realizing I was there. I told myself to stay still. Do not move. Do not make a sound. The sounds of the moose's movements grew louder, and for a moment, I thought it was going to crash right into my tent. I could hear it breathing harder now, its steps heavy and erratic. My heart pounded in my ears. It was so close, I could almost feel the brush of its fur, its massive body just a few feet away. I tried to focus, tried to think clearly. I knew moose weren't naturally aggressive, but if it felt threatened, it could charge. I had no way of knowing what it was thinking. I could only hope it didn't feel cornered or provoked. I had no idea how to defend myself against something like that. No bear spray, no weapons. Just me and the thin walls of my tent between me and an animal that weighed over 1,000 pounds. The thumping of hooves became more erratic, more frantic, as the moose stomped around. It was moving in a circle, pacing around my campsite, and I could hear the underbrush being trampled, the sound of branches being snapped underfoot. I felt the ground shift again, a heavy thud right outside my tent, and then the sound of something massive brushing against the fabric of my tent. My breath caught in my throat. The moose was so close. I could hear its breath through the fabric, feel its movements. I could hear the soft rustling of leaves as it shifted its weight. My heart was hammering in my chest, and every muscle in my body was tense, ready to spring into action, but I couldn't move. What if it stepped on me? What if it didn't see me? I was only a few feet away, just inches from being crushed by the sheer weight of it. One misstep, one wrong movement, and I could be done. The moose took another step, and I could feel the pressure on the ground around me, like the earth itself was groaning under its weight. The tent seemed to shrink in on me, the thin material feeling more and more like a flimsy shield, something that could be easily torn through by this beast. I could hear its breath getting louder, heavier. It was right there, right beside me. My whole body went rigid with fear. Then, as quickly as it had started, the sound of the moose began to fade. The rustling of trees, the breaking of branches, the frantic steps. It all started to move further away. My mind struggled to process what was happening. Was it leaving? Was I safe? I held my breath. I waited. I didn't dare make a sound, not even a whisper. The world outside felt distant, too quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath with me. It took what felt like hours, but eventually, I dared to exhale. The moose had moved on. It was gone. The only sound I could hear now was the slow thrum of my heartbeat, the blood rushing in my ears. I lay there for a long time, unable to move, not sure if I was safe or if the moose would return. My mind was racing, my body trembling with the aftermath of the adrenaline that had surged through me. I had narrowly avoided a fatal encounter. I could have been trampled, crushed beneath the hooves of an animal that didn't even know I was there. The hours that followed were a blur. I stayed inside my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest around me, too afraid to step outside. The night felt endless, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the moose might come back at any moment. But as dawn finally began to creep in, I knew it was over. I was alive. The morning light filtered through the trees, casting soft rays across the forest floor. The air was still damp from the night, the forest quiet and peaceful in contrast to the chaos I had experienced just hours earlier. I cautiously unzipped my tent, stepping outside for the first time since the incident. The ground around my campsite was a mess. Broken branches littered the area, some of them snapped clean in half, the marks of something large having trampled through. The area where I had been sleeping was untouched, but the grass was crushed down where the moose had passed. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in, feeling the weight of what had just happened. If I had moved, if I had made a sound, I might not be standing here now. It wasn't until later that morning, as I packed up my gear, that the full impact of what had happened sank in. I had been inches away from death, so close I could feel the moose's presence, could hear its every breath. If it had moved just a little bit differently, if it had stepped in the wrong direction, I wouldn't have had time to react. It was a reminder of how fragile life could be, how easily things could take a turn for the worse when you least expect it. I don't know what would have happened if the moose had charged. I don't think I want to know, but I know one thing for sure. I will never again take for granted the peace and safety that comes with a simple night in the woods. Every time I look back on that night, my heart still races. I was lucky, very lucky, and I won't forget it. In the end, the woods are beautiful, but they can be just as dangerous. You never know what's out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for you to make the wrong move. And that's what makes it so terrifying. How quickly everything can change, how close you can be to something deadly without even realizing it.